unbelievable. There's not been anything like it since, and I can't find anything in American history that was like it before. That what had happened is that the Vietnam War was going badly. Lyndon Johnson was losing the support of the people, and he knew it. Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Senator Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Others will have to speak for President Johnson, what was in his mind. But as a White House correspondent, I believe the situation to have been President Johnson was weary. He cared deeply. I've never met a president who didn't care really deeply. And Lyndon Johnson cared. He cared about what was happening to the country. He cared about what was happening to his party. He cared about what was happening to him politically. He didn't want to run against Robert Kennedy. And the combination of those factors, all of that, had him announce that he would not be a candidate for re-election in 1968, which he could have been. And at one time, he really ached to run against Richard Nixon before he decided to say, I'm not going to be a candidate in 68. He really tried to help Richard Nixon become the Democratic nominee because he ached to run against him. He thought he could beat him, and he thought it was important to beat him. But now we're in the early stages of 1968, and Lyndon Johnson has announced that he will not be a candidate. But then Senator Kennedy was assassinated. I can't prove it, but there's a lot of evidence to support my belief, which was then and is now, that after Robert Kennedy's assassination, that President Johnson then wanted to re-enter the arena, but he couldn't quite figure out how. But he came up with, mind you, this is my view. Historians will have to make a judgment. As the summer went along, he came up with the idea, the plan, if you will. He was going to strike a new rapprochement with the Soviet Union, with the height of the Cold War. He was going to meet with the Soviet leader and come up with a new peace in the Cold War plan. He intended to go to Chicago and enter Chicago and have the convention say, we have to go with Lyndon Johnson. He had Governor John Connally working with him. And I believe they came to Chicago believing that Hubert Humphrey was not a cinch to beat Richard Nixon, that Johnson would be a better candidate, and Johnson wanted to hold on to the presidency. Senator McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy, was a factor with young people. This was the political environment in which we came to Chicago. President Johnson arranged to have the Democratic Convention in Chicago in a deal with the then Mayor Daley. And the deal was as follows. Okay, Daley, I'll bring the Democratic Convention to Chicago, but you know the atmosphere in the country. I've got to have your assurances that you're going to keep control. Daley, you bet. So they gave it to Chicago. Lyndon Johnson arranged it. He goes to Chicago hoping against hope that somehow he can get the convention going his way. But just before he gets to Chicago, a decisive thing happened. The Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia at what we call the Czechoslovakian Spring of '68. Some of the forces for freedom and democracy that later came to fruition in the very late 1980s and 1990s were beginning to bubble up from the bottom. The Soviets came in and crushed it. They crushed it just before President Johnson was to go. His intention was to go reach some agreement with the Soviet Union about missilery and peace, lower the strain of the Cold War, and come directly from that meeting into the convention. It was not to be. The Russians pulled the rug out from underneath him. I don't think for that reason. For their own reasons, they invaded Czechoslovakia. The meeting with the Soviets is off, and Johnson sort of comes limping into the Democratic Convention, but still hoping against hope. Somehow, some way, they get the convention to go. Mind you, this is before we went to the primary system, which now dominates. In those days, things were actually decided at the convention. As he got into Chicago, the anti-war protests in the country at large were beginning to crescendo. And some of the leaders decided to make Chicago a focal point, which they thought would be easy. As it turned out, it was. That they would bring the anti-war movement to coalesce in Chicago, correspond with the Democratic Convention. And yes, used television to get across how vehemently they opposed the war. It was a cauldron. Mayor Daley, having promised Lyndon Johnson he would keep the lid on, he would keep control, had organized the city, and not just the police. He organized garbage workers and union workers, everything designed to, number one, have fortress-like control over the convention center itself, and total control on the convention floor, unprecedented in American political history. So that was for the convention hall and inside the hall. And then outside the hall, in parks and on streets, at any sign of a protest gathering up, to put it down. Daley had a lot of control, but he didn't have enough control. Too many forces were coalescing, not just in the streets and outside the hall in Chicago, but inside the hall itself. And inside the hall, they had hired to supplement police and the papering of the galleries with Daley supporters. They'd hired an outfit called Andy Fame. Andy Fame Corporation was security people. So they had tremendous security inside the hall and an elaborate security system where movements were restricted. Delegates were instructed, you are not to move except at certain times. And the Andy Fame people were told, you don't let certain people onto the floor, you don't let certain people out. It's all an effort to keep control. But try as they may, try as they might, and try as they did, President Johnson and Mayor Daley couldn't keep the control airtight. And the biggest thing they wanted to do was keep control of the television images. And then we're not able to do that.
So what assignment did you have at the convention?
I was assigned as a floor reporter at the convention.
So you're right in the middle of all this.
Yes, we had sections of the hall were delegated to, assigned to certain correspondents. I had a section of the hall.
Which section did you have? There was a particular
I had the
delegation?
Midwest,
Midwest.
Mostly Midwest delegations, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania. It wasn't all Midwest, but primarily Midwest. But it was more on the geography of the hall, if you will. And delegations were assigned places in the hall based on the strength of the delegation. So while I did have, my recollection was a number of the Midwest states, I had some others as well.
Well, at some point you were talking, I think, to Walter Cronkite, of course, was doing the anchoring. And you had an incident with some of these folks that you just described.
Well, what happened there was an effort to limit what reporters could do, limit our movement, limit our access. For example, once you came on the floor, you couldn't get off the floor. And you said, well, what if I have to go to the bathroom? Well, you had to have a note from Mother virtually to go to the bathroom because they had one of these Andy Fame uniformed people. They looked like something out of a Disney movie. And I'm not saying anything derogatory about them. They had their job to do. But it was all about total control. Now, what happened with that incident, that delegates had been told you can only move at certain times. And a Georgia delegate got up from his seat and started for the aisle. He has a delegate badge on. And as I understand it, he was told by somebody at the end of the aisle, you can't get up now. And to my opinion, quite rightly, he said, I'm a delegate. Here's my delegate badge, here are my credentials. I'm a delegate, and I want to walk around a bit. They said, no. He basically said, to hell with you, I'm going to do it. So he walked. So he started walking. I didn't see all that in the beginning. This filled in later. The time I saw him, here was a picture I saw. I'm standing in an aisle, one of the main aisles, and I see coming a man with the Georgia delegate badge. He clearly was a delegate, had a badge on and everything. And there were some people in civilian clothes, not police clothes, who had him by the arms, had his feet virtually off the floor, and they were quickly trying to escort him off the floor. This is a story. Delegate seems to me he's either being subjected to some kind of thuggery or he's being hustled off the floor for some reason. And all kinds of things. What is this man, an imposter? Has he assaulted somebody? What's going on here? And so, in full rig, we had earphones and radio transmission and a microphone. I basically asked the reporter's question, sir, who are you? What's going on? What's happening here? The goal of the people who had him was to get him off the floor and out of there as quickly as possible. There was a gate, an exit turnstile with an anti-fame person. All this is happening fairly quickly, but I could see, well, they're trying to get him out that gate. If you get him out that gate, that turnstile, I can't talk to him. So I kept putting the microphone up. I brushed the microphone away, elbowed me out of the way, so trying to kind of get in the middle of him, and I tried to stand in front so they'd have to slow down at least to say, tell me, sir, what's going on. And at that point, having elbowing one thing or another, then a guy delivered a very effective punch. I think this guy had some boxing training, because he brought a punch up, dude, with the elbow in, right off his legs, hit me in the solar plexus and knocked me down. And they whisked this guy on out.
And
so
you
that's
were
basically
on the air, weren't you?
Yes, we were on the air. What happened was Jimmy Wald, who was a floor director in the anchor booth, which is high above all this with Walter Cronkite, was using his binoculars. And he saw me get knocked down and said to Walter, something happened down there with Dan. So Walter Cronkite came to me just about the time, just before I got hit.
And that was on the air?
That was on the air. It was live television. Live television was still something fairly new in those days.
Were you injured?
Well, I hurt.
I understand. But
no, I wasn't badly injured. I boxed a little bit in high school and been knocked down before and since.
And did the Daily People give you any kind of explanation?
No.
Or did you?
We had no clue as to what was happening. I mean, they whisked the guy out the turnstile and he was gone. Walter talked to me. We then started trying to find out what was going on. But, of course, the big fog envelops. Nobody knew anything. Who are these people? Have no idea. What do you mean have no idea? They've hustled a delegate off the floor. And at one point, much later, the Secret Service did look into it. And the next night at the convention, they brought a man, they pointed a man out to me who said, we basically think this is the guy who hit you. They had studied the videotape and one thing or another and said, do you want to bring charges on him? And I thought about it for a half a second, said, let me check with my bosses. And we said, look, it was last night. It's beyond us. There's enough chaos. I mean, the whole city, not the whole city, but large sections of the city were exploding with difficulty. The convention itself was careening near out of control. And yes, the whole world was watching. And so I basically said, well, no, I don't think bringing charges against him. I just as soon as he didn't get my area code again, but I don't want to bring any charges against him.